We're back. Appreciate all the support. A lot of success with the last Neo Vintage video. And we're here in Coral Gables, which is kind of like Beverly Hills of Miami, in case you didn't know. And I needed to find the doctor of Neo Vintage, and we found him. Erik, appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
All your knowledge. You have a super beautiful shop, very cool.
Thank
and I want you to drop some knowledge on us.
All right, I'll try. I tend to gravitate towards the 4 and 5 digit reference number Rolex pieces.
Okay.
I do sell a little bit of other brands, but I tend to really heavily focus on Rolex. My personal passion, I would say, is for 5 digit reference numbers. So pieces such as the 16610 Submariner.
What year range is that?
Generally speaking, pieces from the mid 90s to the mid 2000s.
Yes.
That sort of 10-year period is probably what I have the most knowledge of.
Okay.
But it's also kind of where I got my personal interest, because that time period was when I was in college and just out of college. So it's when I didn't necessarily buy a whole lot at that time.
Yeah.
But I was dreaming of what I would have gotten.
Correct.
And
Correct.
So in that regard, what I wound up with when I wound up with my first watch was a piece of that era. And as a result, I just really had studied it on a sort of a macro level. I studied what I was most passionate about, and I learned every little nuance that there was to know about, in my case specifically, GMTs and Submariners. I've always had an appreciation for sports models, mostly because I'm clumsy. I'll bang my hand against a door and I want it to hold up well.
Yep.
I also have a knowledge about the other pieces from that era, Datejusts and Oyster Perpetuals, but the things that I am most passionate about are the subs and GMTs. One of the things that I noticed that a lot of people of our generation gravitate towards is maybe things like similar to me, things that were that we kind of grew up wanting and desiring, but also I think a lot of people are drawn to the fact that specific generation of watches, they're more durable than the previous generations, mostly because they incorporated sapphire crystals.
Got it.
The previous generation with the plexiglass crystals, while still very robust, I think you have to be a little bit more careful with them. I think also some people may have had concerns with water resistance, and if you damage a $10,000 watch, 5 digit reference number, the dials are still available. They're still out on the market if you need to replace it.
Okay.
It became a good thing for the potential consumer to go and buy something that they could wear every day. The 4 digit reference numbers, for example, we have a beautiful 5513 gilt dial here with a plexiglass crystal. That dial is irreplaceable. The gilt dial from the mid 60s, if that gets water damage, it's toast.
So it's like priceless. It's
priceless in a way. I mean, we definitely have a price on it.
Okay.
But
there's always a price.
There's always a price for everything. But if you're if you buy that watch in the mid 20 range, you're not going to be able to replace that dial for nearly the cost of the watch.
Okay.
So much of the value in vintage watches is the dial itself, and so, with we'll say an emerging vintage piece, like something that's 20 or 30 years old, those pieces, because there's so many of them on the market comparatively, and the dials are just out there floating around, if you do happen to damage one for some reason, you'll at least be able to, have it brought back to life.
Got it.
The newer Rolex models, we call those the 6 digit reference numbers, and those are basically the ceramic bezel watches. Those, there's tons of parts. If, God forbid, something happens to your watch, you could always send it to Rolex and they'll swap out the parts for ones without water damage, we'll say.
Does Rolex make parts for these super old pieces?
Yeah, so Rolex has a couple of things. So yes, Rolex does have some parts available. Usually what they do is they change the dial for something called a service dial.
Yeah, we don't want those.
We don't want those.
We don't want service dials.
Service dials are, while it doesn't completely, let's say, ruin the value of your watch, it radically reduces the value of your watch. Also, the service dials don't have the same character as a vintage piece does.
Correct.
Now, Rolex has a secret little known department where they actually restore for an exorbitant fee, but they will actually restore a vintage watch to what it originally would have been with an original dial if, God forbid, something does happen to it. But I don't know anyone personally who's ever actually sent a watch into that department. I've seen some of them on the market, watches that have been restored by Rolex. I just know it's an expense and a very difficult thing to get accomplished.
The secret department.
It's a secret.
Okay, I'd
secret
love to find out more.
Department.
Rolex, I'd love to find out more about your secret department.
Yeah.
I mean, I got a few favorites already, things that I've never seen. This string dial, day date looks incredible.
Really good example too. You want me to pull that out to show you?
Yeah, let's pull that out. You got like a almost Patrizi dial, emerging Patrizi dial.
We do. I'll pull
the root
that
beers. I mean, this is like a incredible buffet here of.
It is. So let me show you a couple of different things. So.
Even this Daytona here, that's got to be special. What dial is that?
So this is a grossular dial. So it's basically rubellite, which is a stone, and they have sectioned the rubellite. And in this case, what we're looking at is a rubellite dial with diamonds.
Okay.
So
rubellite is what? Sorry.
So rubellite is a stone similar to ruby. It's not a ruby, but it's similar.
Similar.
And so similar in color. If you look at a cabochon or an unpolished ruby, it's going to have a similar tone to rubellite. Ruby would be much more expensive to work with.
Do they have some of the similar like chemical makeup in what it is, or
sort of, but no.
Okay.
So. Also, you'll notice that in rubellite, in this watch in particular, there's a lot of veining through the dial, whereas you would not see that in ruby.
Like a
rubellite is probably a little bit more interesting to look at. If you take a slice of ruby, it's going to be relatively translucent, whereas rubellite has a more opacity to it. So it's interesting in that regard, visually to look at. And then this particular watch, the case is made out of white gold. So most often Rolex uses precious metals when they use exotic dials. So anything from onyx dial to turquoise, in this case rubellite, you're going to see those most often done in a precious metal case.
Let me see here.
Sure.
Okay, yeah, I see the grain and the texture.
Yeah.
And this has some good weight to it.
A lot of heft.
Also,
a lot of heft to it.
Does the stone give more weight to
it,
or it's not?
It's so much, but the white gold is denser than stainless steel.
And so this has a sticker on the back too.
It does. It still has a case back sticker. Yeah. If you compare it to even this is also a Daytona of a similar era, just one generation prior. If you compare the weight to this, that's probably heavier on a leather strap than this entire watch is on steel.
Oh yeah.
It's
for
crazy.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yes.
The beach Daytonas.
Daytona Beach collection.
Is this the same era?
Same era, different colorways. So the beaches all tended to be pastel, sort of like pale pinks and blues and yellows, but of a similar era and the same reference numbers.
And as far as I know, the beach models have a super premium.
They do. These do as well. So they're all going to anything with an exotic dial, and really any Daytona in general. Always, they're the most collectible of Rolex watches, similar to the Aquanaut and the Nautilus from Patek. And I notice you have a very nice Patek here today.
Thank you.
Love that.
That's my precious Patek, my Aquanaut. I'm an Aquanaut Maxi. Okay, guys.
Absolutely.
Which neo-vintage Aquanauts are something that I'm super into now also.
Very, very cool watches as well.
5065A?
5065A, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Have
you seen a few of those?
I've sold quite a few of them. So what I love about those is the tropical straps that they use.
Yeah.
The straight lug as opposed to, in this case, these have an integrated lug.
Yeah.
I really like the earlier versions.
It has like the space in it.
Got a little gap.
A little gap.
It lends itself to that vintage aesthetic, which I'm very drawn to.
And I mean, I'm sorry, this is catching taking my breath away.
I'll trade you.
Is that it? Well, actually,
they're close, but I think it's worth a little bit more.
What's the range here?
In the mid-50s.
Mid-50s.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And are the beach models in that same range also?
At a similar price point. The beach models are going to probably be a little bit more, but not a whole lot.
The original band on here, does that add
It does add value.
Value.
And in this particular case, we actually have an additional original unworn strap to accompany it.
Is this color particular to the
It is,
dial?
yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So
Super
Rolex
cool.
tried to match as best they could to the original dial.
And that follows the theme. Again, I keep bringing the beach one up because that's just the one that I've seen all the time, but it has the matching bands on all those models. They don't do that anymore.
They don't do that anymore. So now most of the Rolex watches that feature straps of any sort, you're going to see a lot of rubberized straps, vulcanized rubber over a strip of metal. So the newest Rolex Daytonas that are on, they refer to it as an Oyster Flex.
I love Oyster Flex.
They're fantastically comfortable. They feature an air channel in the center of them.
Yes.
And they actually have a piece of metal inside of the rubber, which gives it its contour and allows it to be sort of elevated above the wrist a little bit, certainly different than a leather strap would be.
Maybe, you know what? I'm going to make my prediction. Everyone's making their 2024 predictions, right, of what Rolex is going to do. You just inspired mine. Rolex, my prediction is a matching color band on a day date or a Daytona. Precious metal Daytona with a matching color band. Let's see.
It wouldn't surprise me if we saw one.
The throwback.
Yep, absolutely.
That would be so cool.
So speaking of Daytonas, the other Daytona that we looked at here, this is the generation just prior. This is a 16520. What's special about this watch is this piece has a zenith movement.
Okay,
Rolex
that's the zenith.
Currently produces, all of the watches that they produce have in-house movements. This had a zenith movement, which Rolex altered the movement very slightly and put their rotor on it. But that's what this generation was known for. And prior to this generation, they were manual wind. So this is the first automatic in a Rolex chronograph.
Okay.
And this particular watch has something also unique about it in that the subdials have started to change color slightly. And when I say unique, I shouldn't say that this is, not that this is the only watch, but what makes them individual is that the subdials change color at a different rate, and some of them turn very dark brown, some of them, like in this case, is an emerging of a brown tone.
Who's this guy, Patrizzi?
So Patrizzi is the person that they've named those emerging tropical colored subdials after.
Okay.
And this particular one has what we would call a Patrizzi dial, or a Patrizzi. In this case, I would refer to it as an emerging Patrizzi because they're still relatively faint.
Okay.
Give it some time, throw it in your safe for a few years, and you'll notice that this will darken a little bit.
Okay.
So it'll maybe pick up an orange hue or a brownish orange hue.
So the darker the hue,
the more desirable.
Okay, and the more expensive.
And more expensive. Now, some dials, quite different than this, which has started to turn brownish. This in particular would have originally probably been black, but it has started to turn an olive green. So this is what Rolex calls a string dial. So it's a string of diamonds around the dial.
Factory.
And from the factory. And it has baguettes for the baguette diamonds for the indices. But the fact that it has changed color is desirable, certainly to me and to the collector community writ large.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes I'm going to pull another watch out because it just happens to be also a tropical dial. This is extremely unusual. This dial has started to turn two different colors. So I've nicknamed it the Shirley Temple, and I've done that because it, to me, looks like grenadine being poured into ginger ale. What's really beautiful about it is how gentle the color has turned. It's not a bright red, and it's a very soft champagne. This dial originally would have actually been blue. And so it has radically shifted from its original
That's outrageous.
state. Yeah.
I mean, you can't make that, you can't repeat that. This is,
You can't.
It's just
It's
magic.
a one of a kind.
It's
I've
magic.
never seen anything like it. I've seen them turn champagne, but this has been, to me, it's it's the most exciting tropical that I've seen in this generation 5-digit reference number 16618LB Rolex Submariner. This is my favorite of this generation day-date. That the fact that it's turned that beautiful olive color, and if you know the modern Rolexes, the olives for whatever reason.
No, it's really, it looks olive.
It looks as could be. And the olive is the color now that everyone lusts after.
Correct. But so what year is this range?
So
or
this particular one, I think, is in the late 80s. I have to look up an exact.
okay.
I don't remember
Okay.
off
So
the top of
late
my head.
80s, and then this is
This is a little bit
90s.
newer. Yeah, a little bit newer.
Okay.
This is going to be early 2000s or late 90s.
With the subs, I remember like something with whether it has pinholes or not pinholes.
Yeah.
What year is that cut off? Because I know you probably know.
It's actually different on the gold models versus the steel models.
Okay.
But in short, Rolex did a few different things. On their Submariner line, they had 3 different dial variants. They had ones that were luminous material on them was tritium. And then in 98, 99, and I say 98, 99 because it's not exact with Rolex, but we know that in 98, 99, they switched to Luminova for that 1.5 year period. And those dials will be at the 6 o'clock portion of the dial, they're going to have an indication that says just the word Swiss. Whereas this is going to indicate tritium at the bottom of the dial.
Yes.
You'll notice like
Swiss minus T?
Yes,
Something
the
like
T
that.
stands for the tritium. And then just after the Luminova dial variants, they switched the dial to say Swiss made at 6 o'clock.
Yep.
And those are super Luminova.
Okay.
Now-
so tritium, Luminova,
Then
and
super
Luminova. Okay.
And
Okay.
the earlier cases had drilled lug holes.
Okay.
And then Rolex switched to, around that same sort of time period as the Swiss made ones, they switched over to hidden or blind lug holes. Rolex refers to it as true borné, which just means blind hole. And
True Bernet.
true borné.
A Bornet.
It's a
okay.
French
Okay.
word. That's about all the French that I know. But it's a
Awesome.
French word, and it basically gives you the idea that the hole is not visible anymore.
Cool.
And I like drilled lug holes. The market writ large has decided that blind lug holes are more valuable. But man, this makes changing a strap as easy as could be. So that's probably why I like to switch my watch straps up. I rarely will wear
Especially, well, in that period.
during
right?
this period. Yeah. So the
yeah,
5-digit
yeah.
reference numbers.
Yeah,
If you look at the bracelets, they're a little jingly.
Yeah.
And I also think that cases of this generation, they're a little bit more svelte than a modern Rolex. I'm wearing a Sea Dweller today, which is a 43 millimeter tank of a watch.
Yeah.
But it's a big, chunky watch. I don't think this looks as good on any strap. But if I were to wear it on a strap, I'd probably wear it on a NATO strap.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more industrial, a little
Sure.
bit more military aesthetic.
Yeah.
But these, or a Submariner of this generation, looks fantastic on leather.
Yeah.
And it's just so easy if you have a drilled lug hole for the average person to change their watch strap using a paper clip.
Sure.
Whereas maybe with the blind lug holes, they might need to take it to a jeweler to do.
Yeah. I don't even know if I could do that. But I would come to you
I've
and you'd hook
scratched
it
enough
up.
watches
Yeah.
over the years that if you bring it now, I'm pretty sure I won't scratch your watch.
No,
But that's usually what happens. If you look at the back of the case of watches, if people are self-inflicting and they're trying to do it themselves, they wind up scratching the back of the back of the lugs.
Okay. Yep.
with whatever they're using to
That's
change.
kind of like looking under the hood of a car, a vintage car, if you're
It's
going to
like
buy
that.
one.
It's like that.
Look under the case if you see those extra scratch marks.
That just means they probably changed the bracelet to a leather strap or
Okay.
NATO strap, from time to time.
So we got root beers here now too.
So I do. I
Are
pulled
these
out.
both
I
root
pulled
beers?
out 2 root beers.
Okay.
Of a similar era, but what makes these two quite different aesthetically is that this one has a radial sunburst dial, and this one has what we call a nipple dial. The indices on the nipple dial appear like nipples.
Yeah.
They kind of
Okay.
look that way.
Okay.
And this nipple dial also has just a much richer chocolatey brown color.
Mhm.
Other than that, these 2 watches are relatively similar and of a similar time frame. Obviously, the bezel inserts, you'll notice that one of them is bicolor and one of them is just all brown. But
What's the year difference?
there's about a
approximately, or-
6-year difference between
Okay.
these 2.
Yeah.
Another way to tell them apart, generationally, would be the clasp.
The buckle.
So this is
the
going to
clasp.
have a sort of a double. It's going to have a safety and then a traditional clasp, and this just has a clamshell opening clasp.
Wow, that is in beautiful condition.
This
And
particular one is in
I mean,
a pretty amazing condition. It's also unpolished, which is
well, hold on.
which is really nice. Yeah.
This is, I mean, you can tell that I mean, I can tell this has never been polished before.
Yeah.
Like, it's so sharp.
It's so sharp, and the coronet is so crispy.
I've
That's
never
usually the first thing
seen-
that I look for. I noticed that a lot of my contemporaries, when looking for, if a watch has been polished or not, the first thing they do is start to look at the lugs.
Yeah.
My instinct is always to look at the coronet. If that clasp has been polished, that's the one thing you can't fake. You can recut a case, but you can't add metal to a stamped clasp. There's no way to do it. You'd have to have the original tooling that Rolex did to press that embossed logo into the case.
So okay, so that's the alpha. That's the alpha on trying to find
for
trying to find if it's been polished or not. And
Yeah.
and absolutely, I mean, you guys will see soon on the close-ups. This is outrageous.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I love root beers. I do. I was so glad they brought it back. And yeah, no, it just, you have such gorgeous pieces, man.
Thanks, man.
I thank
Appreciate
you
that.
again so much for having us. And just so people know, as far as price range on these two
They're going to
root
be
beers,
in the $12,000-$13,000 range in general. Root beers of this generation are going to be in that, let's say, $11,000 to $15,000 range. Depending on whether they have the original box and papers.
Okay.
That certainly adds value to some collectors. My 2 cents on that is, on a modern watch, let's say we're talking about a 2024 Rolex, I expect to buy a watch with box and papers. But 20, 30, 40 years ago, people didn't know to keep that. It wasn't important. When the warranty ran out, they threw away the paperwork. So now watches of that era, I mean, I love it. It's an added bonus if they have the original paperwork. But what I'm really looking for is condition. And I think anyone who's going to buy a vintage piece, that should be your primary focus. It shouldn't be like, oh, does it have box and papers? That should be the last question you ask. The first is, send me pictures of the case.
Yeah.
I want to see what type of stretch is in the bracelet. So one of the things that we'll see is if you drop the bracelet on a watch like this, is that they start to sag. Now, this particular one's very tight, so it's not droopy.
Yeah.
But you'll notice more so with Jubilee bracelets that they start to look, saggy.
Yeah,
They start to droop quite a bit. Limp. There you go.
Yeah.
That's what I want to focus on.
Okay.
is the condition. What's the dial look like? Is there any spotting on the dial? Now, some watches, I'll pull some other pieces out here, you should expect to see some deterioration of the dial in some way, shape, or form. Now, some of that is caused by the luminous material that was used. I'm going to pull out a piece in here that's quite rare. It's a 6610 Explorer. Now, what's different about this than the other ones that we've looked at Luminova and Superluminova and Tritium. This dial actually used radium for the luminous material.
Radioactive radium?
Exactly.
Okay.
So if you have a Geiger counter, this will light up your Geiger counter. And it's a watch that you certainly could wear every day. I'm not saying I would wear it every day. Number one, because it's an older piece and you want to wear something like this maybe more selectively because it's delicate, but also because that is giving off radiation. So I don't know that I would want to wear it on my person every day, all day, because I don't know that I want to be exposed to that much radiation for long periods of time.
Yeah.
This sits in my safe if it's in my personal collection.
What year is that?
So this, I think, is 1966.
1966.
And if we look closely at the dial, we're going to notice that there's some matting of the dial. So some watches of this era would have had a glossy dial, some would have had a matte dial, some would have had radium. Of this era, they would have all had radium. And the radium itself affects the dials in different ways. Sometimes you see spotting on the dial, sometimes you'll see what's called radium burn. So around the indices, you'll start to see sort of like little pitting and burn spots that luminous material kind of affected the enamel on the dial itself.
The radium is so radioactive, it's affecting the paint.
100%.
So I guess it could actually affect your skin or your.
Like I said, I mean, certainly, if I were a watchmaker, I'd want to work on these very selectively, because once you decase the movement, you definitely have more exposure to the radium material. Anything that's on that dial, when exposed to to the air, and watchmakers often use little air pumps to clean dials. If they're puffing that into the air and you're breathing it in, I don't think it would be good for you.
Wow.
So in this era, Rolex used to employ women to paint the luminous material onto the dial. They are known as radium girls.
Oh my goodness.
You can go into a crazy rabbit hole.
Oh
You
my
do a whole
God.
video just on the radium girls. What they used to do was take paintbrushes, lick it,
What?
lick the paintbrush, dip it into the luminous material, paint it on the dial, put it back in their mouth
No.
so that their paintbrush was nice and sharp, dip it and paint and paint and paint. The problem is that it killed almost everyone that worked on those dials in a very, in a very quick period. All of the women that worked on those dials literally, their bodies started to deteriorate. They started,
I've never heard this.
they actually changed color.
Is this the secret department again from Rolex?
A different department. The radium
hush
girls
hush?
literally changed color because they were absorbing radioactive material, and they, died. Rolex sent out, during that time period, they sent out replacement dials and replacement bezels for people in particular who had the GMT. Rolex during that time period made a watch that had a Bakelite bezel with radium material, and they would literally call you up and say, hey, we need you to, or I don't know if they called, but they would contact you and say, come in and have your dial replaced.
Yeah.
Come in and have your bezel replaced. Come in and have the hands of the watch replaced. And
So
all
is
of
that
those dials were recalled.
so? Did that contribute to why these are even more rare?
Exactly.
I guess.
So most watches of that era are going to have service parts.
Okay, which
So
we
the
don't want
dial would
service
have
parts.
been exactly.
Yes. Okay.
We try to avoid it.
But
We
wow.
try to avoid
What
it. But
a
we also try to maybe don't wear this every day.
What a story. I'm going to put this back here.
Yeah. This watch in particular would not have had that bracelet during that time period. This was put on at a later date.
Okay.
It would have come probably with an oyster bracelet that looked a little bit more similar to that, and it would have had rivets on the side of the bracelet. We acquired it with this bracelet on it, and I kind of like it. I think it gives it some character.
Yeah, it definitely has cool character. All right, we're back. Guarded Crown, Coral Gables, here with Erik. The man, the myth, the legend of neo vintage is what I've just come to learn, and yeah, it's been amazing so far. These are really cool pieces.
Yeah.
Please tell us more about them.
So, well, I brought this piece out in particular because it has what's known as a double sign dial. So on the dial is a stamp that says Rolex, of course, but there's an additional one that says Tiffany & Co. And in the collector community, anything that has two brands of this stature together on the same, on the same watch, on the same dial, adds a level of excitement. And so this particular one's a real nice example, very clean, in a 34 millimeter case size. So for someone with a little bit smaller wrist, some of the watches that we looked at earlier were 40 millimeters, a little bit bigger, a little bit chunkier. This in particular, 34 millimeters, works well for someone who has a smaller wrist or someone who really wants a vintage aesthetic.
Was 34 millimeter a men's size in this era?
Absolutely. So 34 and 36 would have been what most of the watches of the era were produced at. While the GMT was a little bit larger, the Daytona a little bit larger. Early Daytonas were only 37 millimeters.
What year is this again?
This is
Range?
mid 80s.
Okay.
I'll have to tell you an exact number, but actually this would have been 70s.
Okay.
So
Double stamped.
Double
Tiffany, Rolex, Air King.
Air King, you got it.
Let me see this guy. I've never seen a Tiffany stamped Air King.
Yeah,
so,
there's not a whole lot of them floating around.
And is this tritium?
Tritium.
Okay. All right. I got it right.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm learning. Tiffany & Co. Precision. And even like the font and everything is so delicate and beautiful.
It is. It is.
Really cool.
Yeah. And then these two watches that I brought out are basically the same case design, one of which was made sort of as a part of the James Bond 007 history that Omega started using their watches in James Bond movies. They paid for the rights to do that. Ian Fleming, when he wrote about James Bond early on, he referenced oyster-cased Rolexes. He did not ever mention Omega, but in the movie world, I guess you pay enough money and donate enough product, you will definitely make it to the big screen.
Wow, that's a fun fact,
so,
though. Okay,
so all of the watches that we see that are Omega are product placement. All of the watches that we saw that were Rolex in earlier films were because that's what the author intended. This particular one is called the Spectre edition for the film of the same title. And the watch next to it is actually cased in platinum. So if you feel that, it's a giant chunk of metal.
Oh, wow.
The dial on this is made of malachite. So the reason why I brought this one out is because earlier we looked at a grossular dial, rubellite, from Rolex. This is Omega's take on a stone dial. This particular watch, at least for the past couple of years that I've been tracking, it's the only one that's actually hit the market, the secondary market. I'm sure a few special clients at Omega were able to get them and pull them into their private collection, but we have not seen any others make it to the market. So as far as I know, this is the only one available for sale currently in the world.
Is this a limited edition or?
So limited production.
Limited production, yeah.
Omega never actually put a limited edition number on it, but certainly there's none out there for sale.
You have to assume so.
Yeah. Whereas this watch does have a limited edition number, but it's one of 7,007 versus probably just a handful of these actually went into production.
The buckle's platinum as well.
Buckle is platinum as well.
This is a hefty piece.
Special piece.
Wow.
So the reason why I'm personally drawn to stone dials is because my grandfather was a lapidary. That is a person who cuts stone and cuts gemstones specifically. My grandfather, when I was a little kid, cut malachite in my garage.
Wow.
When he moved from New York down to Miami, he didn't have space for all his tools, and so my mom and dad said, yeah, come use our garage. And he would cut the stone there, and then he would drive down to the Seabold building where you and I, I'm sure, go every single day. And in Miami, the Seabold building is the jewelry district.
Yeah.
New York has 47th Street. In Miami, we have this one or two buildings that basically the entire industry revolves around. And my grandfather.
But you don't have to go there. You can come see us, and we'll run that mission for you. Because parking is nuts, and The
Seabold building is not meant. I don't think the general public really would want to spend a whole lot of time down there.
Yeah.
It's really meant for producing jewelry or buying watches in bulk.
Yeah.
Very wholesale centric. But
so is that what led you into this business?
Yeah, actually, yeah. My grandfather, shepherded me into the business, so to speak, from that aspect. But my mom was a jewelry designer, and so my mom, when she started this store almost 40 years ago now, in 1985, she said, hey, this is what I'm going to do now. And I would just go there after school. Instead of going home, I would go to the store, and I cleaned toilets and swept floors for the first 10 years. But eventually, I got to spend time there and learn how to make jewelry. So I would sit at the bench with our master jeweler, and I would learn how to fabricate jewelry, and I became, pretty good at it.
Wow.
But the whole time, all I was dreaming about was watches. Sure. So now I'm able to kind of fuse both my passion and then what my early childhood and young adult life training, which is designing and manufacturing jewelry. So the jewelry that we manufacture here, we manufacture it all here in Miami, and it's all my own design work.
Okay.
The watches, I get to appreciate what other designers have done.
Yeah. So how much is this one of a kind platinum?
So I think
can't find one anywhere, but here at Guarded Crown in Coral Gables, Erik has one for you.
I do have one. It's in the mid-30s.
Okay, mid-30s.
Range. And I think this particular one is unworn.
In platinum alone.
In platinum alone, it's a big old chunk of platinum. Yeah. Many thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
Omega, when they released this watch, I think it was in the $42,000, $43,000 range.
Okay.
This one is remained unworn, and we're selling it for below retail, which is wonderful for the end user.
Sure.
And mostly just wonderful in that it's truly something that you'll never see anyone else wear, like that watch. It's not one that you're going to find, anyone else wearing that same piece.
And is that what you would say you specialize in, finding one-of-a-kind pieces?
I prefer to find watches that have wonderful stories or exotic dials.
Okay.
I sell a lot of everything. So if somebody wants a new Submariner, I'm happy to source that too, because that's how I started.
Sure.
I guess you could say over time, maybe you graduate into finding pieces that are more special. But I think it's important, whoever the consumer is, that me as a seller of watches, that I want to be able to provide them a little bit of knowledge, and most importantly, what they really want. And so if they're looking for a basic Submariner, let me find them the best example I can.
For sure. And by the way, we just so happen to have this really cool motorcycle here. Tell us a quick little something about this.
Yeah. So I'm opening a new store a few doors down from this one to focus more on lifestyle product. So one of the things that we're going to do is, of course, carry watches, and then the product that would tie in with that watch. So if you could envision a vintage field watch that was worn in the trenches, and then maybe this Harley Davidson with only 33 miles on it.
This is a Harley?
This is a military transport 500cc Harley Davidson.
Okay.
And these saddlebags on the side are what they would have used to transport goods, and the plastic case in the back is where they would have carried their firearm. A machine gun would have gone back there.
Is this legal?
It's legal to drive. It's ready to go. I have the title in hand.
Okay.
And what I was most drawn to, of course, was the color. I think anything that's related to military paraphernalia and that's olive drab, you're going to see me pounce on it for my inventory for my new store.
Okay.
Our corporate colors at Guarded Crown are olive drab green, and then also like a khaki sand color. And so,
can I ask you, where did Guarded Crown come from?
oh yeah. So on watches like the Submariner, there's two pieces that protect the crown. Those are called crown guards.
Okay.
Or a watch with a guarded crown case. And so I tied that in with
I love it.
with the corporate
yes,
naming.
Man. Yes.
Yeah. And so
awesome.
this piece is just for me.
I mean, this is one of a kind.
It's definitely certainly that it's never been driven. It only has 33 original miles on it.
Okay.
So it's
if you're looking for something you've never seen before, much like all these other incredible pieces, hit up Erik, Guarded Crown. He's opening a new store, lifestyle brand. I've never seen anything like this before. If you're looking for one, hit him up, DM me, I'll hook you up.
Yep.
Super cool, man. Always just appreciate you super much, man. Thank you. Such a pleasure. Web3 Watch Plug, On Demand Lux, Guarded Crown.